Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean Casey. I'm the director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. It's my distinct honor to welcome all of you to this session on Interreligious Dialogue as a form of peace building in Israel and Palestine. I'm also so excited that my old friend Rabbi Kronish is here. I think we've only seen each other in Jerusalem in the past, so it's great now in your American phase that we're able to draw you down from New York and have you talk to us about your new book. I suspect most of you here know Rabbi Kronish's long resume, and I will simply say that in the book, which we have for sale in the back, if you've not had an opportunity to purchase that book, when we're done, you'll be able to do that, so I encourage you to take advantage of this. But in his new book, The Other Peace Process, Interreligious Dialogue, A View from Jerusalem, he outlines, I think, really the theory and practice behind his 25 years in Jerusalem as founder and director of the Interreligious Coordinating Council in Israel. And he is now allegedly retired, although I hear this rumor that rabbis never really retire, right? Yeah, it's not a thing. Transition, okay, I'm going to make a note of that. That's very good. But we are certainly pleased and honored by your presence and by your work. I recall we had many long conversations in Jerusalem about your work when I was working at the State Department as part of the I guess I would say ill-fated efforts on the part of the last U.S. administration to help bring peace there. But your emphasis on peace building at the local grassroots level is in contrast to the way many Americans think about peace in Israel and Palestine as being a top-down sort of phenomenon. So we're very pleased to have you today. Rabbi Kronish is going to speak for 20, 25, 30 minutes, and then we'll stop, and then he and I will sit together and we'll just engage in question and answers from the audience. And I have this standard pat where in Washington, D.C., I'm going to ask you to disguise your comment as a question. And I'm also going to ask that if you have a sermon or a speech, we have plenty of ample ecclesiastical context we can point you to. We're not looking for that today. So please, the more questions we can get, the more wisdom and insight we can get from Rabbi Kronish. So when we segue to the Q&A, I ask you to identify yourself both by name and by institution and give us your quick question. And we may take 2 or 3 at a time and let Ron respond to that. And we'll see if we can't, in the balance of our hour and 15 minutes together, get through all of your questions, which I know is a very utopian idea. But join me, please, in welcoming Rabbi Kronish.
Thank you, Sean. It's nice to see you in Washington, not only in Jerusalem. I remember well our many conversations and attempts to understand what was going on then. I'm not going to give a PowerPoint. I'm old school. So you might actually look at me and not at the screen. And I like to say that even though I'm a rabbi, I will be brief. Okay. So I want to share with you a little bit about what I learned from 25 years of working in the grassroots, in the vineyards in Israel and Palestine. And I will do it more by headlines and not go into everything, as they say in the internet now. Click here, read more, buy the book, or follow me on my blog, whatever you like. I do want to acknowledge that there are many friends in the room, and I'm sure that people will want to engage in conversation, and I actually prefer conversation and dialogue than long lectures, so I will try to keep myself to a limit and just make a few points, and then we'll talk. So, as Sean said in the introduction, I've been actually very shocked for many, many years living in Israel and meeting with many visiting groups and hosting many of them in my home for dinner. And I would say by dessert, they wanted the solution. Do I have the solution to the conflict? And I said, no, I didn't exactly have it, but we can talk about possible ideas and things like that. And I was always struck about particularly how Americans think that in the Middle East, politics would solve everything, which I think doesn't solve everything here in America, so I don't know why they thought that. But maybe it's because of what Americans read about Israel, Palestine, the A story, you know, he shot him and her shot him and how many were killed on each side and that kind of thing, so that they don't get to the back of the page story, which isn't there very much anyway. So I want to focus my remarks more about peace-building work than peacemaking work, that is, the political work. Most of you in Washington know the story of the ups and downs of the political peace process. Certainly the one, the Palestinian one from the 90s up until today. But I just will say a few words about that. Most of you in this room will recall that in the early 90s, we actually had a peace process. It was called the Oslo peace process. I found when I was cleaning up my papers an article I wrote in September 1993, a few days after the peace process, where I talked about the euphoria in Israel. When I say that now, people think I'm a little off. But I could say Israel and Palestine in those years, for a few years when people thought peace was at hand. And that the conflict was coming to an end. And throughout the 90s, with all the attempts at peace and the various peace accords with several with the Palestinians, one with Jordan in 94, the old one with Egypt from the 70s. So we had what people here in Washington used to call political horizon. There were a lot of progress. The last one, you may recall, was in 1998. It's called the Wye River Memorandum. In case you don't remember who the Prime Minister of Israel was in 1998, his name was Benjamin Netanyahu. I always like to remind people of that because prior to that, he demonstrated against the Oslo Accords. But when he came into power at that time, he was convinced by Clinton and others that he should shake hands with Arafat and actually sign a peace accord. And I usually like to add that little footnote because he did take out a pen once and use it to sign a peace accord, and perhaps he could do it again, although it doesn't look very likely at this moment. So since 1998, and particularly since the failure of the Camp David II Accords in 2000, we've been on a downward slope. I have a little lecture, which I won't give you, where I used to draw it by hand, a kind of mountain, where we were climbing the mountain, and we got to 2000, and we were almost there, and then since 2000, we've been going downhill. And we have replaced the peace process, but by the war process. We had one in Lebanon, 3 in Gaza, maybe one tomorrow morning in Gaza, who knows. And the political peace process has all but been abandoned. It's there somewhere in theory, somewhere along the lines. Even this country's president once in a while will give lip service to it, and so will the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of Palestine. But for all practical purposes, it's dormant or dead. And so that has led to a situation on the ground of what I call political despair. I know I've been in America the last 3 months. There's an American version of this thing, too, but I'm talking about the Israeli-Palestinian one, which has been going on a lot longer, which means that people on the ground, on both sides, the Israeli side and the Palestinian, do not believe anymore that their politicians are really trying to solve the conflict. The American government had, or maybe still has, I think he cut it now, but had a program within USAID, which ran for the last 10 years or so. It was called CMM. Have you heard of this? Conflict Mitigation and Management. You could get some money to do a program. We got some once a few years ago. What's missing? Resolve. the American government, when they did took out resolve because they know that, well, they know that NGOs couldn't do much to resolve the conflict. So we're in a period of political despair, which means that organizations like the one I used to run on the ground have a lot more difficulty bringing Palestinians and Israelis together than they did in the good old days of the early 1990s, when it seemed like our politicians were serious about political peace, and therefore we wanted to know who lives in Ramallah and who lives in Bethlehem and who lives in East Jerusalem and vice versa, and get to talk to these people. So the work of the peacebuilders, who, unlike the politicians, do not have to get governments to sign formal treaties with one another, but whose task I define as getting people to see about the benefits and possibilities of living in peaceful relations with one another, has been made much harder by the failure of the political and diplomatic people in making any peace agreements in the last now 20 years. So peace building, bringing Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs, remains a very daunting task, especially in the light of the absence of political progress. Nevertheless, I and many of my colleagues in Israel and in Palestine spent a lot of time in bringing Israelis and Palestinians together in dialogue and discussion. And what I'd like to share with you is a little bit about what I learned from that exercise. When we brought Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews together in dialogue, we usually invited them to get together according to various target groups that we established. So we work with religious leaders, youth, we would be high school, young adults, women's groups, and educators. Those were our 5 targets. We would usually try to create groups of 15 to 20 people where we invite them into a process that would take at least a year. The longest running dialogue group ran 5 years. It was a group of religious leaders, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, which I read a lot about in my book because we had a lot of fascinating experiences. But we did a lot of work with youth and young adults, 10 years of that kind of thing. We worked with Auburn Theological Seminary, some of you may know it, in New York City, and we ran a international, we were the Israeli-Palestinian part of an international program known as Faith to Faith, which was a marvelous program with teenagers from South Africa, Northern Ireland, Jerusalem, they call those Middle East, Jerusalem, and inner city America. Very interesting choice. I don't know who made that choice. It ran for 11 years, and we had many fascinating experiences there. So we did a lot of work with youth and college youth, which I actually found often quite hopeful because the youth were less burnt out and less cynical than the rest of us who've been through too many things. And we, over time, developed a model of dialogue which actually kind of worked for several years. And I'm going to share that with you briefly. I should say also that when we formed the dialogue group, we very consciously made it a Palestinian-Israeli group. That is, the essence of the struggle is between 2 national movements, Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. Palestinian Arabs, as you know, live inside Israel. They live in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in Detroit, and in other places around the world. But we're talking about Palestinian nationality versus Israeli Jewish nationality. These 2 national movements are the heart of the struggle. So we would make our group 2 nations and 3 religions. That is, the 3 religions would happen automatically because the Palestinians who are invited are mostly Muslim and a minority Christian, a very small minority Christian. And on the Jewish side, you would usually have a variety of Jews representing themselves, but belonging to religious groups or non-religious groups. And our groups were always facilitated by trained and supervised facilitators who learned how to basically train people to listen to one another. How many of you have been to the Middle East? Yeah, so you may have noticed that listening to one another is not our strong suit. Okay? And so we had brought this, kind of American import of training people to listen to one another. And every dialogue group we put together was done with careful facilitation, which is one of the reasons I think it worked usually fairly well. We did something else which was interesting along the line, and we and other groups decided to make our facilitation what we called co-facilitation in 2 languages. So most of our groups would be in Hebrew and Arabic. So if you could speak either language you were comfortable with. And the translator, at the beginning, was usually Palestinians, but more and more young Jews are learning Arabic. So you could have the translator be Jew or Palestinian, but they needed to know Arabic and Hebrew well. And the translator was supposed to be neutral, which, was not 100% true, but they tried. But in any event, we had the people speak in Hebrew and Arabic for 2 reasons. One was cultural respect, which was very important. And secondly, it flowed better in a certain sense. And on the other hand, it slowed it down. And it gave people a chance to actually really hear. And particularly with the youth and young adults, we made this an orthodoxy, so that the graduates would talk about this method as something which was very important to this. Footnote, I picked this up actually in Germany once. There was a group in Bendorf, Germany, of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, JCM, that ran conferences for many years, and I went to one of them a long time ago, and they were doing this with German and English. And so we adapted this back in Israel. And we weren't the only people to do it. Many of the groups that work on dialogue with Palestinians and Israelis now use this method, and I think it's a very important method. So we invited people into dialogue, and for us, dialogue did not mean Q&A. Dialogue was a long process of really listening, compassionate listening to each other's stories, personal stories, national stories. And over time, we developed this method. And so the first thing we did when we would bring people together is focus on what I call personal identity. We would spend some people call it personal narrative. A lot of people simply telling their own personal stories with one another on a very human basis, often over coffee, often over retreats, and visiting each other's homes and visiting each other's synagogues. We did not start with the history of the conflict. Okay? Those groups who used to do that usually ended by the end of the day. It was over when they realized that they had the same timeline and the same dates, but otherwise they didn't agree on anything, so they just went home after arguing all day. I had a friend, maybe some of you know his work, Jay Rothman, who has written a lot about this stuff, and he used to come to Israel and do these workshops, and he said they would start with the history of the conflict and fight, and he came up with a new idea, which I really liked. His idea was, can we envision the future? And let's talk about that, and then what are the many different ways and things we have to do to create a better future? And he's written all kinds of stuff on this, and done interesting work both in America and in Israel. So we brought people to get to know one another as individuals, as human beings. People were not invited because they represented their party or their church or their synagogue or their government, but they just represented themselves. And we, in doing this work, we had to confront the issue of serious stereotyping one against the other. So when you bring Israeli Jews to meet Palestinians for the first time, what are they thinking? Terrorists, suicide bombing, right? Enemy. Not anybody I'd ever talked to before, and I'm kind of afraid. I'm nervous and afraid. And what are the Palestinians thinking about? They're coming to meet Israeli Jews for the first time? Oppressors, settlers, soldiers, killers. As they often will tell us, the only Israeli Jew I met so far was at the checkpoint, and he wasn't in a dialogical mood. Okay? So the images, you know, in the West, sometimes you start simply with ignorance. We're starting with like minus 100 of fear and hatred based on 100 years of conflict. So it's very different when you're operating in an area of ongoing conflict. So we spent a lot of time on individual personal identity, getting to know each other as a human being. And out of that experience came what I like to call radical discovery number one. I hope this doesn't shock anybody here, but in my neighborhood, it's pretty shocking. The other side is human. There are really human beings there. Okay? Did I over-exaggerate? I don't think so. Joe Monfils telling me I didn't over. The other side is not human. We can kill them with impunity. I sometimes call this de-demonizing the other. And you don't, from my experience, know that until you have this real face-to-face encounter. So that was our first lesson. The second thing we did as a group that did interreligious dialogue and as a form of peace building, you might know that most of the groups, certainly in Israel Palestine, who have done dialogue work over the years, have been secular. We were talking about this in your office. Most Israel, the overwhelming majority of Israelis are still secular. It's not so on the Palestinian side, but the image is in our culture that religions, particularly two of them, here's the good news for any Christians in the room, the Christians are off the hook. The war with the Christians ended like 50 or 60 years ago. We're not killing each other anymore. But the impression is that the Muslims and the Jews and Islam and Judaism are these radical extremist religions that either occupy or do terror. That's what they're about. If you follow your social media or read your local press, that's what you'll know. So in addition to the problem of the national problem, there's this problem out there of religions, Judaism and Islam in particular, have what I call a very well-deserved bad reputation in the region, encouraged by the media and the social media and so forth. So we wanted to do something to overcome that a little bit because many people were blaming the other side because of their religious extremist groups' actions, which they would say, all Muslims think that way, and all Jews are like settlers. See? So we did something which was really kind of simple, and it actually worked. We did interreligious text study. We opened up sacred texts, and we got rabbis and imams and qadis and ministers to teach each other's texts, even in small ways. And usually for the first time, anybody reading the other person's text. I didn't know that Islam said anything about ethics or justice. I thought it only was about jihad. Okay? If anybody thinks I'm exaggerating, I am not exaggerating, okay? So we did a lot of this text study, and we discovered that even in small ways, with good teachers, and with people ready to listen, being open, you could change some of these very negative perceptions about the other person's religion. And this was, for me, radical discovery number 2. That the other person's religion wasn't what I read about in my newspapers. or on my social media. It was something else. And the discovery for us, and again, this is, I think, very different than the American experience, certainly of late, is that these religions, Judaism and Islam, and of course Christianity, have something in common. And how could I have known that before if I never opened the other guy's book ever? But now I discover it's not just we as humans have something in common, our religions have something in common. They all seem to talk about ethical issues and justice issues, and I really had no knowledge of that before and no experience with that. So this opened the door to further explorations of others' religious traditions. And for us, we felt it developed two levels of trust. The first trust is the personal. I can talk to a person, we can have a dialogue without screaming at one another, without proving who's got, the right version of history, and we can actually talk and have a pretty open discussion. Okay, yes, it's moderated, but we can be open. We can talk genuinely in this room. And the second one was that on the interreligious level, we could have discussions, we could learn things about each other that were totally new and a little bit life-changing for some of us who were very afraid of the other person's religions and religious views from everything we'd read and heard on the news. So that was our second level, and for us it was very important, partially because we were not the only, but we were one of the very few groups doing that as well, and it was important to us. The third thing we believed in and practiced was once you've developed these different levels of trust, now we will talk about the core issues of the conflict. You can bring up, you're in our dialogue, whatever you want, whatever's bothering you, whatever you're hearing in your family, your community. But here's the rules. You can't do it by saying, your prime minister is an idiot, because we knew that already. And your president said this yesterday. No, we're not talking that. That's not the discussion. The discussion, what do I think? And everybody was taught by their facility. What do I think? What's happening in my community? And what experiences can I share as a person? And so we did a lot of that, and I was shocked because I wasn't facilitating. When I saw the first facilitator going to do this one year, I said, this is not going to work. This has no chance of working. He says, give me a chance, and he was right. It did work because there was enough ambiance and enough openness and enough curiosity to really want to hear what your friend, colleague that you met over the last few months or few years had to say, which would often be very different than what you heard on the news in the morning when you came to the meeting. And out of this developed two things which I found interesting. One is a very a great awareness of what we call in our neighborhood the double narrative, right? There is this meta-Palestinian narrative and meta-Jewish Zionist narrative out there, right? 48, 67, and up until today. Two different narratives. Yes, you all know about this, right? 48 for the Jewish Zionist side is the War of Independence, the War of Liberation, it's a Jewish holiday, and the other side is the Nakba, the Great Catastrophe, and on it goes. So we have two very different narratives. Most Jews and Palestinians in the neighborhood have never heard the narrative of the other. Never. They wouldn't encounter it in school or their community center or anywhere unless they come to some kind of dialogue group like ours or a few others where you can have this experience. It's kind of against the law, or not against the law. The education systems don't do it. You may recall the Council of Religious Institutions did a study a couple years ago. Was it during your time? And they found they spent about close to $1 million of the State Department's money, and they discovered that neither in Palestinian textbooks or in Jewish Israeli textbooks, they don't learn anything about the other. I could have used that $700,000 in my organization, saved them the time and money, you know what I mean? So we learned about the double narrative, and everybody got sensitized to the fact that there is a double narrative, whether you like it or you don't like it, or whether you agree with it or don't agree with it. And then, because usually our groups were diverse, we learned that there are multiple narratives under every banner of narratives. There are many different narratives, Some of them are reflected in political parties or other ideologies. But there is really no one narrative. You know, I often get, what are the Israelis thinking about X? Well, just about everything. What are the Americans thinking about X? You know, so there isn't one narrative, there are multiple narratives, but yet underlying it, there is this fundamental double narrative which people kind of grow up with in their schools and communities and with their mother's milk. The fourth thing we believed in, and we said was important, but I want to be upfront and honest with you, didn't work too well, was we called it moving from dialogue to action. This was very complicated. It was often, if you were in a very good dialogue group, it was harder because you were in this bubble and you got people, everybody was listening, and you thought you could take it back to your community tomorrow morning where everybody else is listening, but then you bring in a speaker and nobody's listening, they're just shouting at them. So it's very complicated, and we found that moving from dialogue to action was very hard, and it was very difficult to do, even on the grassroots level, when the general climate, as I described before, was so much against all these things. But we persevered, and by the way, other groups who are still doing are trying to do small actions, grassroots actions, and meeting up many walls, but are making, I think, some progress in recent years. The last thing I want to say has to do with, I call it looking towards the future. You know, I don't know if you're going to want to talk about this. This is more political, one state, two state, no state. If you look down the line, I'll give you my personal view to shortcut this. I think the two-state solution is the only good idea in town, the only fair and just one that has any chance of working, even though it hasn't worked for the last 20 years. I also think there's something very interesting when you reflect on it, that there is a change in what I call the zeitgeist. The international community, as it's called, likes the two-state solution. They think it's it. And so maybe. But I'm still, if you will, a believer in this. I think all the others are worse. But the point I want to leave you with is that even if we have one next week or no, next year, what do they call it here in Washington, the ultimate deal? Even if we have a political so-called solution or treaty again, this comes back to my original point, it will not solve all our problems. It will not get all Palestinians and Israelis used to love one another any more than it did in Northern Ireland or South Africa or any other place, which is what they call in the conflict resolution, post-conflict. Post-conflict means the war is ended. We've stopped shooting, but it doesn't mean that hatred is ended, okay? So even if there is another political solution, and I like to put it in a more positive, when there is another political solution, we will still need, and we will need even more so, the peacebuilding world, the NGO world, to bring people to learn to live together in peace for the long term. That's not the role of the politicians in most cases. That's the role of the NGOs, and the political establishments could help with money and support and other things. But our long-term goal is still to change the hearts and minds of the people to learn to live in peace with one another. And we do what we can now and hope for another peace agreement so that we can do even more in the future.
Thank you. Am I on? Not yet. Not yet. How many religious leaders does it take to turn on a microphone? Well, thank you very much.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you're on. Thank you very much. You gave us a lot to chew on. So we've got about 40 minutes left here. So let's take a couple of questions to start off. So recognize there's a microphone coming, John, and introduce yourself and then give us a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Ron. And congratulations on all your success. I'm John Borelli. I'm here at Georgetown. All your success. I remember when you decamped from Florida for Israel to begin this, and you've proven what we've experienced here, that when there would be a major negative development in the Middle East, the dialogues that persisted, the trilateral dialogues that persisted, were those particularly among women, where they weren't talking politics, but they were talking everyday needs. But how do you answer the question, sure, this is really good, and we're building solid friendships and helping perspectives, and maybe there is some individual action that comes out, not group action, in the lives of these people. But in the meantime, over this long period, the attrition, the loss by Palestinians of any kind of political hope has just gotten worse.
All right, let's see if we can take another question as well. Let's come up here.
Hi, everybody. Rachel Gartner, rabbi on campus. Hi, Rabbi Kronish. A few days ago, we heard from Roots. From do you know Roots? Yeah, it's an incredible grassroots organization by settlers and in the West Bank and Palestinians living in the West Bank who are doing dialogue together. Yeah, Hanan. Yep, Hanan. Right, it was Menachem Froman's. Yeah. He was here, and a family member of an Arab, Palestinian family. Yes, the Awad family. It was incredible, and they do not espouse a political solution as a group, a specific solution. But it was interesting to hear Rabbi Schlesinger talk about a one state, two peoples. And he didn't talk in depth about it, but we got the sense it was sort of a confederation where you would be a citizen of the one state, but you live in one of the communities that was either Jewish or not Jewish or Palestinian. So I'm curious if you know about this solution and what you think of it.
That's enough to get you started. Why don't you take a shot at those two, and then we'll keep moving. Yeah.
So I'm aware that dialogue on the grassroots is not enough. The theory of dialogue in the grassroots is supposed to influence and have multipliers and rise up, and at a certain point, the top down meets the bottom up in the middle and can change society. That hasn't worked in our neighborhood because we haven't had a critical mass. I'm being very candid with you. But I do think that, and I do agree with the premise of your question, that political hope is, or the lack of political hope is more severe on the Palestinian side. But I think, as I read it, both sides share that now. I'm not saying the governments, I'm saying the people, okay? Both sides, in what I read is political despair, don't see any hope coming out of the politicians, and therefore the attempts of grassroots political groups and so forth are still there, but they're much smaller. As some of you know, when we had Peace Now, I don't know, when was now? 30 years ago, 35? And you would get 400,000 people to a demonstration because there was a sense it could have impact. Now you can't produce that many people. By the way, since you mentioned women's groups, the strongest peace group in Israel right now is Women Wage Peace. They're the most persistent. They don't have great numbers, but they're out there every day, and they organize through their demonstrations the biggest numbers, but still they're not significant numbers to change the political reality. So I think that the job of us on the ground, particularly religious leaders, is to keep hope alive somehow. And a lot of people I'm involved with are doing that through their educational work, to keep the vision alive and not let it die completely, because the politicians, particularly on the right, are trying to kill it. So, yeah, there is a very serious problem about despair versus hope. I like to tell one story. We were talking before about George Mitchell. I just finished reading George Mitchell's memoir called The Negotiator. It's a wonderful book. And I met George Mitchell a couple years ago. I was speaking at a rector's forum at St. Bart's, what's it called? Episcopalian, big Anglican church in Manhattan. And I was talking about this issue of political despair, and Mitchell was in the audience, and he asked this Jewish question. It was a comment, but the moderator said, "George Mitchell, it's okay." And what he said, and I actually read it in the book just last week, so my memory is accurate. He said when he went to Northern Ireland, he spent 5 years negotiating Northern Ireland with, 15 political parties and all kinds of difficult people. He arrived in Belfast on the Monday of the last week, April 1998, and there was a poll in local newspapers, and it asked Protestants and Catholics there, what are the chances for a peace agreement here in Northern Ireland? And 83% on both sides say there's no chance for a peace agreement here in Northern Ireland. And on Friday, he had it. So I always tell that story because I'm with Mitchell. There's always a chance. Who expected Anwar Sadat to fly to Israel way back then? Or even Yitzhak Rabin to shake hands with Yasser Arafat. So there's always a chance. Okay. The second question about roots. So just to elaborate on this. There's an area 10 minutes south of Jerusalem, south of Bethlehem, called the Gush Etzion area. It's an area where there are 35 Jewish settlements. It had a reputation for a long time as being the moderate settlers. That's somewhat changed now. And in recent years, there's been a lot of terror there, particularly at a particular junction, the road. So about 3 or 4 years ago, a local rabbi named Hanan Schlesinger, who was a student of Rabbi Fruman, who passed away, he met a Palestinian guy, Ali Abu Awad, who had been in prison, and it turned out he was a nonviolent Muslim Palestinian. From the Jewish side, he was from the moon. Yes, fellow? I mean, nobody had ever met a nonviolent Muslim Palestinian. And they became friends. And they created a little center called the Markaz Karama, the Dignity Center. That's what it's called. Dignity Center. Get that word, dignity. Because the biggest problem from the Palestinian side is the lack of dignity and the daily humiliation of the checkpoints and all the rest. The ongoing, not the political, but the ongoing. And they created this center, and they're in dialogue, and they do youth work, and they're the only group, as far as I know, really operating in this way in the territories in the West Bank. And they don't give up. So they're really non-political. They've created this idea. There's another group, I think it's called Two States in One Homeland. The idea is you're here and we're here, and neither one's going away. And you like the idea of statehood for national identity, so you keep that. But we'll share the merchav, how do you say that? The area together and so forth. It's not a totally new idea, but it's the best they can say at the moment. And I think it's a good idea. But it has no, what I'm trying to say to you, it has no political backing from any political forces in Israel at this time. Okay, so it's a very theoretical but a very nice idea. Okay, but it's not like they're marketing it in the Knesset or something like that. Okay.
Okay, let's go here. First question.
Peter Kovac, retired Foreign Service. I really would like to know, because of my incursions into the Jerusalem area, I find that the engagers become kind of a cell unto themselves, and that getting any kind of contagion going is very difficult. And the comment about women's groups kind of accords with what I observed. My question is, Are there other mechanisms that you've seen successful in sort of spreading the peace contagion, if I can call it that?
Okay, another question? Let's go, why don't we go to the back?
I actually have two questions, but I can limit it to one if you'd like.
Go ahead, give us both.
Okay, thanks. All right,
And
so my name
tell
is,
us
yes,
who
my name
you
is
are.
Simone Bach. I'm a master's degree candidate at the Georgetown University Security Studies program, where my research focuses broadly on governance and ethics in the Middle East. So my first question is that, given what you've already pointed out, Rabbi, that solutions to the conflict will not be completely political, what advice would you have for government policymakers in the U.S. or elsewhere on how to assist in a realization of grassroots peace or otherwise? My second question is, what do you think about the approach, if you're willing to comment, of the King of Jordan to address radicalization through the Common Word document, for which he's also requesting U.S. government support, which, amongst other things, addresses religious radicalization that could exacerbate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
So, about spreading the word. For several years, I don't know if it's still there, I belonged to a group called Peace NGOs. It was 50 Palestinian peace NGOs and 50 Israeli group NGOs. We used to meet regularly. We were organized by the Paris Center for Peace, who got money from, I think, the European Union or the Italians or somebody who believe in peace. A lot of people in Europe believe in peace, probably more than in the Middle East. And I discovered there, and for some reason, this doesn't get widely reported in the media, that the contagion had spread a bit more than I usually think. I'm not talking millions of people, but I'm talking many thousands of people. So there are quite a few groups, often under the radar, that are still out there trying to do things. One of my favorites, I'm on an advisory board of a thing called Kids for Peace. Have you heard of that one?
It's a great group.
Okay, Kids for Peace started in St. George's Anglican Church, I don't know, 15 years ago or something. It was a very small program. They would take 4, 4, and 4, I think, when they started, something like that, 15 people. And they'd send them in the summer to camps in America and this and that. So they've grown and developed. They're run by a Reverend Josh Thomas, based in Washington, but I think he lives in Texas, but I think their office is here. They, in their program, they work with youth in the elementary school, high school, and now alumni. And a few months ago, I went to meet the 2 young directors in their offices, a Jewish woman named Meredith Rothbard, who grew up with Rabbi Melchior, if you know that name, and was a kind of a student of his, and the Palestinian director until about 2 weeks ago was a young man, Tariq Saman, who came up out of my organization. By the way, their budget was cut by the current American administration. All the groups who were CMM or doing peace cross-border, they're out of money now. So anyway, so he's out of a job, Tariq. But I went to interview them, and I said, "What's going on?" It was like right after the declaration about the embassy years before it, and I thought they were going to be in a terrible. We have hundreds of people joining, all over Jerusalem. People are joining. I said, "What about anti-normalization?" No, people are coming. Why? Because we're working on what they matter. What matters is that we're working on their identity and our identity, and we're talking, and hundreds of people are joining. So I just give that, and their families are coming, and so it's small, but you hear that about some of the other groups. There's a group called Hands for Peace, of course, Seeds of Peace, which started here in Washington. So these groups are out there, not getting much attention, but still persisting in the day-to-day. And it's very hard to spread the contagion, as you call it, or when the atmosphere is pretty negative. Your question about what government policy could do to enhance the grassroots groups. So when the USAID started the CMM program, that was really good news. And I was part of a group that's still around called OLMEP. You know about OLMEP? Alliance for Middle East Peace. They started with, I don't know, 6 of us, 10 of us, 12 of us. And now I think there's about 90 or 100 organizations. And OLMEP, Alliance for Middle, which is based here in Washington, is trying to, for years, they've been trying to not just get out of money a little $10 million out of the Congress, which, as you may know, here in Washington is not a lot of money, but get international funds from all over to support these kinds of areas. So a little bit of this is chicken and egg. If you had a lot more money and you have a lot more people doing this, you would spread the contagion more. Okay? Part of it is related to resources. Okay? So that's one part. I don't know the specifics of the common Word document, but I will share with you my own little pet peeve on documents. I'm not a great fan of documents. We have lots and lots of documents. They're probably great for the researchers. Here at Georgetown, you want to go to the library and find a lot of great documents. So there's a lot of good ones. Believe me, a lot of good ones. But not enough action on the ground after the documents. So I heard about this document, and I know people who've been to Jordan, met the King. I don't think these documents have any real resonance with the overwhelming majority of people who've never heard of them and are not going to hear them. So, except for the researchers.
All right, we had a question here, I think, and then we'll go back there. You're in the second row, first here.
Hi, thank you so much. This is fascinating. My name is Chris Estradi. I'm with the State Department, the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. I'm curious to know more about how you motivate people to come together. You've kind of alluded to it. Maybe you could elucidate a little bit more about what incentives there are to bring opposing groups together. Thank you.
And then just right there.
Yeah, hi, I'm Steve France with Episcopal Peace Fellowship. And I was curious just to know a little bit more about Rabbi Kronish. I mean, what your specific form of Judaism that you practice and preach. Are you a dual American-Israeli citizen? Do you consider yourself a Zionist? And if so, how do you define that?
And Catherine Marshall here will get 3 in this round.
Catherine Marshall at Berkley Center. We all know that people tend to be skeptical about dialogue, particularly in secular circles. That is blah blah, and there's lots of focus on evaluating impact and so forth. I'm curious as to how you've thought about that and gone about it.
About the evaluation side?
Impact. Randomized control trials.
Okay. So how do we motivate people to recruit people? First of all, I repeat, it was easier in the 90s than it was since 2000. Okay? The way we try to motivate people was to target groups. So if it was a women's group, it would be led by women. Reach out to women, what's on your mind? So they recruited a group of professional women who are all going to go back to their schools or social work settings or wherever they worked and do their thing there. If it was religious leaders, when we recruited a group of religious leaders once, we recruited Orthodox rabbis in Israel. I'm a Reform rabbi, I'll come back to that in a minute. Because we wanted to get out to the mainstream. And we recruited Orthodox rabbis, imams and qadis, ministers, and in our context, they were all men. It was the only group we ever did, which was all male because of the sociology of religious leaders in our part of the world. Okay, so as high school youth, you know, we recruited them for specific purposes in specific ways. But so in the good old days, there was a lot of curiosity. Who is the other? And here we offer you this unique opportunity to actually talk to the other in a very kind of safe way. So a lot of people say, well, that sounds interesting. Maybe I'll join. And then what we would do is we would recruit, you know, with social media and reaching out to people and talk. But we would also interview people. If you're going to be in a dialogue group with us, it's like in Judaism we have this thing. If you want to convert to Judaism, we warn you a few times. Maybe you should think about this. You know, we've suffered a lot. You don't want to suffer, things like that. So we tell you dialogue may be difficult, and you may going to hear a lot of painful things that you may not. So we prepare you. So we go through an interview, and then we'll often go through what I call a workshop. To, as you said at the beginning, the monologuers can go somewhere else and do their thing. But if you want to be in a dialogue, you have to, you know, show some signs that you have some listening genes and that you really want to hear these other stories. So at a certain point in time, and I think even to this day, among some people, there is still a lot of curiosity to have this kind of opportunity to meet the other in a non-political, very kind of safe space. And I think that attracts people even now. About dual citizenship and that kind of thing, right? So I'm a Reform rabbi. In my personal life, I'm a Reconformadox Zionist. That means I share a lot of things with different Jews. Some are Reform, some are, I have a daughter's a conservative rabbi, I had a sister who was an Orthodox Jew. So I pick up from a lot of different traditions. Today they would probably call that post-denominational or something like that, or pluralist or whatever it's called. And I'm a liberal humanist Zionist. I have a great essay about this. It's a good story. You know, the Presbyterians every couple of years have a convention and they want to divest from Israel, or actually they want to think about divesting from Israel. They never really divest, but they raise the subject, and then the establishment Jewish organizations get very nervous and they have to go to the conventions to get them to behave. So I used to meet Presbyterians all the time. They would call me from the PCUSA in Louisville, and we're coming over, we want to have lunch, and can you bring some people? And so I brought people for lunch, and one year there was a group called the Presbyterian Study Group, Middle East Study Group. And they came and we had lunch together, and then a few months later they issued a report. So I don't know if any of you remember this. And the report was very critical of things the Israel government was doing, and very one-sided. But a month or two before the report, I got a call from somebody, and I said, would you write an essay about your narrative, your liberal humanist Zionism? And I said, fine. And I wrote a very nice essay about this, which actually a few people read and liked. Most people didn't read it. It appeared on page 183 of the appendix of the report. But the 3 Jewish professionals who were studying these things sent me very angry emails. And 5 other people who were monitoring me in those days and what I could say and not say. Now I'm retired, I can say whatever I want. But they accused me of guilt by association. Just having my name in that evil report by these evil people meant that I was anti-Israel and anti-Zionist and God knows what. So I'm a liberal humanist Zionist who feels that Israel ought to live up to its prophetic Jewish values and even live up to the values of its own Declaration of Independence. I admit I'm in a minority in my country right now, but that's a little bit about more who I am. By the way, I would add maybe one more phrase about that. When I sat down 3 years ago and I transitioned, and I got a desk in the library and I decided to write this memoir, the first summer I wrote this long autobiographical chapter about how I got to where I was. I wanted to call it, jokingly, How a Nice Jewish Boy Moved to Israel and Discovered that Other People Live There. Okay, so that's kind of what happened to me. I moved to Israel. I was a normative Zionist Jew. I worked only among Jews. And then one year I fell into this job, 1991, and I discovered there were Christians in Israel and Muslims and Palestinians, and I got to know them. And I devote a fair amount of time in my book sharing
for others who want to know, what are they really about? What are their identities about? And what kind of people are there? And talking about some of the many people I met. So I'm a Jew who, through my journey, learned to recognize that there were others in our country and took upon the responsibility, and I think it should be not just my responsibility, our responsibility to treat the minority as we would have liked to be treated when we weren't in charge. So, yeah, I hope that's helpful.
And what about Catherine's questions about evaluation?
All right, okay. Question about evaluation. So, the best conference I ever attended in my life was a workshop I went to several years ago. It was held at Windsor Castle in England, run by the World Council of Religions and Peace and some other local groups. And it was all about people who'd done research on conflicts around the world and discovered, many of them, that when you had the political solution, not everything was solved. That there were a lot of things that need to be done, as I indicated before, post-conflict. And I remember we had to read a book. We all had to read a book called by Lederach. What's his first name? John Paul Lederach, now at Notre Dame. It was called Effective and Sustainable Reconciliation. You probably know the book. It was the 10th anniversary of the book. It had been put out by the U.S. Institute for Peace. And I was assigned to read the chapter on evaluation and report. So I started off my talk by telling the following story. One of my jobs as a director of organization was to apply to raise money, right? So I used to apply for grants to everybody, and any government was giving grants. So the European Union has had for a long time what they call Partnership for Peace program in Israel and Palestine, and you could get significant amounts of money, and I and other people would try every year. We never succeeded with them. But the first year, before they shortened their proposal, it was a 55-page proposal. Anybody remember these things? And on somewhere like page 52 or page 53, it had the following question under something like risk analysis or something like that. And it said, first of all, you have to spend the first 50 pages telling every detail you're going to do next year. You know, we're going to meet next Tuesday night in July from 7 to 9, and X amount of people there. We'll have these amount of outputs and inputs and insights and all these things. So you had to define this detailed schedule and a timeline and all these things. And then this question came up on page 52, and it said, what might prevent your program for going according to timetable? So I said, this was two guys in Belgium, and where are they? Brussels. They're sitting in their cubicle, and they said, after 50 pages, we got to give these people a laugh. And then one year, I went to the CMM workshop at the Tel Aviv embassy, and some guy said, you have about a 10% chance of getting a grant, and in order to get it, you have to have at least a master's or a PhD in conflict resolution, because you have to read 4 theories of change and figure out which is the best and which one you will use. I know people who've gotten these grants, and then they couldn't do them. They could do them in the lab at Georgetown or at Harvard, but they couldn't do them on the ground. So why do I tell you those stories? I have a bias against the social science evaluation of human interactions. Okay, it would be like asking the rabbi, we're going to have a social scientist come and evaluate what you did after 25 years in your rabbinate with your congregants. That's kind of, so I don't think it works. I know the pressures. You have to prove input, output, but mostly, from my experience, these are unprovable things. And people sit around with advisors and consultants, and they make up all this stuff in order to try to get the grant, and it just is not doable in the real world. So I think there's a bias that was created by social scientists, which certainly doesn't help us religious leaders who are trying to create spiritual transformation and psychological and all these other things. So I don't have great experience with it myself. And to be honest with you, we never had much money for evaluation in order to do it significantly. So unfortunately, as you may know, this is the reality of a lot of groups. And it also, I say one other thing, it also favors the large institutions. Only the large institutions who have lots of money and lots of staff can do these things. And I think they're meaningful because a government or a foundation needs to do this because, you know, the government says so. But on the ground, they don't help me by, this friend of mine now in Kids for Peace, they were telling me that they have so many compliance officers, and so every step you take, you need 2 steps backwards to figure out how did you take the step, and which step did you get on the right, and it makes the work on the ground almost impossible to do. So I'm sorry if that doesn't directly answer your question, but that's the best I can say in evaluation. I've never in our field seen a useful one that would work. Yes.
So let's be our last round. Okay, so let's go to Joe, then we'll come back to Rachel. No, and see if we can get to the last. Do you have a question?
I didn't have a question,
Oh, I thought you did. I'm sorry.
but I was just nodding.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, let's go back to Rachel then. All right. Well, yeah. Why don't we take his question and then I think we can get 3 in here for you.
William Whalen, former USAID. If you were in a room with a group of young belligerents, what would your core message be to them to get them to reappraise the direction they're headed? Thank you.
Did you have a follow-up question, sir?
Yeah, there was Rabbi Kronish, you referred to prophetic Judaism, and I've been very focused in the last year on Jerusalem because of the changing status in the last year. And I know that in Islam and Christianity, it's with all of the breaches of their prophecies, it is about peace on earth. And I know that certainly Christians draw from Isaiah and other of the great prophets, but it's not all that clear to me whether sort of mainline, the most common forms of Judaism really see Jerusalem as the place of universal peace. So if you could address that theological issue, I'd really appreciate it.
We've got about 5 minutes for you to tease that out. One more here. Rachel.
I want this to be a question. I think it's a question. So it's about traction and contagion, and you know, being on a college campus now for 8 years here and 5 years elsewhere before, the loudest voices seem to be the best funded and the most polarizing. And what it takes, a room of belligerents is replicating itself here on campuses across the states. In fact, the guy from Seeds of Peace was saying, I'm sorry, from Roots. He said, "You're bringing the conflict to campuses. Why are you doing this?" And so, where's the money? Because the money, those are the most moneyed and resourced voices. And we in the United States, as Trua, as a group that I work with, Rabbis for Human Rights, are really good partners with some of the work that the groups that are similar to the work that you're doing. But we can't. How do we support the work that you do? How do we together find the resources to amplify these voices in the places where they're not reaching?
Okay, that's our last set, I think. Ron?
So there's this wonderful group, I don't know if you heard about it, called Combatants for Peace. Lochamim L'Shalom. They're doing exactly what you asked. They're bringing former religions together. I have a friend in New York, a Rabbi Bob Kaplan, who does a lot of great work in New York, and he comes to Israel a lot. And he has an opposite method to mine, and he says, let's take action first, and we'll talk as we act. And I think that's what Combatants for Peace and the Bereaved Family Forum and some of the other groups like that are doing. They're trying to take action, or even if it's just educational action. Sometimes it's political action. Sometimes it's social protests. And as they do the action together, they talk it. So that I would go along with that message. In other words, don't only talk. Talking has its limits, although it's important. Jerusalem, theology. Well, these are big questions. This is a whole nother talk. Isaiah. I'm a great fan of Isaiah. One of my best dialogue partners, Christian. Oops, did I turn this off? Hello. Named Bishop Munib Yunan. I don't know if any of you are on it, Bishop Yunan. We moderated a dialogue group for many years together, and we're still good friends. We have many good stories to tell. I discovered years ago when we used to get together just to study, a group of us, and he wrote his master's thesis in theological seminary on Isaiah. So we talked a lot about Isaiah, and I don't have the exact number, but the Jews read from Isaiah at least 15 times or maybe more during the year in what's called the Haftarah, the prophetic reading when we read the Torah during the week, including, of course, on Yom Kippur. So it's kind of surprising to me how what you call mainstream Jews, Orthodox, have missed it. You know, they read it so many times, and it's on Yom Kippur. They also, you know, we read about Hagar and Rosh Hashanah, how they missed that one too. So I think the aspirations around Jerusalem are very central in Judaism. I tend to think they're even more in Judaism than the other religions, but they're there in both. And everybody has this vision of the heavenly Jerusalem, which is supposed to be the peaceful Jerusalem. But there's a great gap between the heavenly and the earthly. And I think our role is to do what we can to try to close that gap, even though we're not going to close it 100%. About polarizing voices and money, you know, so we have this Jewish expression: if we don't have imim kemach ein Torah, if you don't have money, you can't get too far. The AIPAC has more money than my group did, and don't be surprised. And most of the, I was once interviewed by a researcher. It's quite a few years ago by now, and he asked me, what did I think has been the impact in Israel-Palestine of all the peace and coexistence groups on the big picture? And I thought for a minute, and I said to him, what's been the investment? And then I'll tell you about the impact. So the investment hasn't been very great. And it's an interesting question. Why, even in the earlier years, when the more hopeful years, why there wasn't massive investment in this? I don't know the answer. I know that I've studied a little bit the Northern Ireland conflict. You know, before it was solved, they had the Irish Fund, and lots of people got that and started pouring huge amounts of money for all kinds of grassroots things. But it didn't work here, and I don't know the answer, but I think it's an important question. It may be, well, I don't like to say too late, but it's a bit late for it, but it's never too late. And therefore, it tends to be that certainly in the current environment, peace-oriented groups, Arab-Jewish coexistence are in the minority, and the funders tend to not be major funders. So it's an important question for the future, yeah, and worth strategizing about. I'd say for the future, I'll leave you with this. That's one thing we ought to strategize about. Another one has to do with how we get our message out. So in my last years in the job, even though I was at advancing age, I started getting into social media because you had to, right? And we started a Facebook page and all that stuff. And I quickly discovered that with the click of a button, you could reach a few thousand people, whereas going 10 at a time was a little slow. And I attended a conference, I think Sean was there in Vienna, of Kaisid. How many years ago is this? About 5 or 6 or something, a few years ago. Talk about money. We don't know how many millions were spent just on that weekend. Zillions were spent. And I attended one of the workshops I attended there was a workshop on social media. And it was a young man who was representing Google to the Arab world. And he got up and he was on the panel. And he said something like this. He said, the extremists have really gotten it. Excuse me. They chop off heads and they're on social media the next minute. And millions of people seem to watch it. And not just that, they're very active. And all these extremists are very active. Where are you peaceniks in social media? Do you have a combined strategy? Have you thought it through? Or are you just doing a little Facebook, a little Twitter account? And I think that's very important. I think we don't get our message out enough. Or if we get it out, we get after only our friends on Facebook. And we really need a social media message so that people will know that the current mood and the current thinking of the current administration is not the only way to think.
So the name of the book is The Other Peace Process, Interreligious Dialogue, Review from Jerusalem. Please join me in thanking Rabbi Ron Kronish.